Hello, and thank you for joining me for this ADOS conversation. I want to let you know that we are not debating the legitimacy of ADOS reparations, but rather how those reparations, once approved, and I believe they would be approved in our lifetime, would be dispersed to ADOS individuals. My guest today, Jonathan Bogan, and all of his contact information is in the description below. We've created this video in a way that you can enjoy it while doing other things on your computer, as most people do while they're on YouTube. Thank you so much and enjoy. Able to do. Now, before we get deep into it, again, I want to let you guys know my guest is Jonathan Bogan, author of John. Go ahead and tell them your book. I'd always love it when you do your presentation. Of course, I have all his links in the description, but John, go ahead and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, my book is titled Say No to Big Government, My Case for Maximum Freedom, published back a year ago this month. And the subject of the book is about showing people why it is not in their best interest to rely on the government to take care of them or to manage the economy. People need to understand that whenever the government grows, whenever taxes go up, regulations increase, government spending grows, that their ability to prosper is decreasing exactly parallel with the increase in the size of government. And I go through history in the book going back to the founding of this country up to the present day, and there are different phases in how we have increased the size and scope of government throughout the last couple hundred years of American history. And it just shows us today that our economy grows so much slower. We make almost no progress in many areas that we used to make enormous progress in, and it's not a fluke. It is due to people giving the state, not just the federal government, but state and local governments in America, more power, and the result is that the government mismanages, it spends too much, and it wastes too many resources and misallocates resources. So we have a deterioration of our quality of life. And so the book is about 400 pages, including dozens of pages of citations at the end to let you know I'm using factual information. Any claim I make in the book is cited. I have hundreds of citations in the book so that you know I am putting together real factual evidence and research to let people know that we have a serious problem going back generations with government. So that's what the book talks about. And I have a YouTube channel titled Libertarian Black Man, in which I have produced already dozens of videos going back the last 6 months. I just recently started doing this after the book got published, in which I talk about other things that I haven't completely hashed out in the book, as well as current events, to give you a good perspective of what's going on in the economy today and what we should do about it. So my whole entire agenda is to convince us that smaller government is the answer to dealing with our economic and social issues in America.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, of course, all of his links to his channel, as well as to ways you can contact him, please go out and get his book. I just had it on the screen for you there. I'll have the link to the book at Amazon in the description. As always, I also have, again, as I said, his Twitter and his YouTube page in the description as well. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about Yvette Carnell. We're going to be talking about the ADOS movement. This woman, again, has been the leader of this movement in regards to getting African Americans or Black Americans or ADOS, or what are called the descendants of slaves, right? The American descendants of slaves, to recognize that America has a moral obligation to repay what they have done to Black American people, to repay them for the suffering of their ancestors, to help bridge a disastrous gap, right, that we have between the white majority and Black people who are in this country against their will, right? They are not people who chose to come here. They were brought here generations ago and not been able to be put in a position to actually be American. And that really means a lot. And if you haven't checked out the Breaking Brown channel, I honestly suggest you do that. As someone who is a first-generation African, I'm a deep believer in what the ADOS movement is doing. I think I know, John, you're probably going to have the counter argument, but I am so in belief of what they're doing. I think it's an awesome thing. I think it's righteous. I think you're on the right side of history when you support the ADOS movement. Are there going to be, situations where this could have some disastrous effects? I don't know, John. That's why I have you on the show today to explain. But I also want to put out there, again, as a first-generation African, that I understand the benefits that I have within the society. And I understand, John, the benefits that you have as someone who comes from that legacy, but have been able to be lucky enough to be born in a family that does not endure the legacies of slavery, right? If I'm correct. Now, if I'm wrong, correct me, John, when I let you speak. But as I say, I just think for the majority of Black Americans in this country, I think this will be a boom. This will be the best thing that ever happened to America in terms of the ability for them to spend money, implement money into their communities. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create businesses. John, why do you think it's not going to work, if that's what you think of this ADOS situation?
This is about cash reparations, right?
That's correct.
I just want to make sure.
Absolutely. Okay. This is about the ADOS demanding cash reparations from the United States government to individuals who can claim that they are descendants of American slaves, Black American slaves. Okay, well,
I can definitely say that for myself. If you go to the Ancestry.com website, you can actually, if you are someone with that legacy, you could hopefully trace back some of your ancestors back to during the mid-19th century. I have done that. So my ancestry comes from the southern United States, where slavery went all the way through into the 1860s. So I do have that lineage. However, here's the thing with cash reparations. I think it sounds like a great idea. It sounds like the government making amends for the sins of the past regarding slavery. But implementing the program, the cash-based reparation program, is a totally different situation. You know what they say, the devil's in the details. And I do believe that African Americans are due something more than what they have today. But I think the issue with reparations is how to implement it. So, for example, when we talk about cash payments, questions come up as far as how much do you pay? Where does the money come from? How long do you pay? What would it cost in total? And would it do economic damage to implement that program? Any kind of program that sends out funds is going to cost something. And so I think it's good to have the conversation. I would love to have a conversation that goes into the details of of what exactly reparations mean, as far as how much money is it per person, per family, how long do you pay, how much are we owed. I'm interested in hearing the ideas about that, but finding the money and doing it in a way that does not do economic damage, that's the challenge, because right now the government is so overextended just trying to maintain the departments and agencies and programs that it has now. So if you're going to introduce a new program, you would certainly have to remove other existing programs to make way for any kind of reparation program. And if it involves spending money we don't have, that's when you get into money printing, that's when you get into devaluing the currency, and if you do that, ultimately you hurt African Americans the most, because as their money loses value, they're less able to support themselves because the cost of living would go up. So I think that there's a lot to hash out as far as the details of a reparation program, but my concern is that we would cause economic damage in trying to make it happen, because we already are in more debt than we can ever hope to pay back. If we added on another government program like this, and I think it would be trillions of dollars, just estimating it, then it would doom us financially. We wouldn't be able to sustain it. So, but again, that's where the details come in. So I think the best way to help the black community would be exactly as I talked about it in my book. The reduction of the size of government would put more money into the African American community, and real money with value, versus a program where checks are sent out and where money has to be created out of thin air in order to make that happen. So free markets, smaller government, I think would actually be the greatest form of reparation to blacks, versus a program where we would have to, I guess, levy a tax or print money or reduce, eliminate other programs to make way for this one. I think you would do more economic damage in that sense. But again, the details need to be hashed out in order for us to know exactly what we mean when we say reparations.
Understood. And John, I mean, when you say that it would do economic damage, I mean, obviously, are we being theoretical, or can you give us, and I'm sure you can, an example, a short one if you can, of how a group of people received money and that somehow hurt the economy overall? Because when I hear about us printing money, that's typically been for a war, that's typically been for a major project that had some kind of national significance, right? The Guadalcanal Canal or something. I know I'm not pronouncing it right. But I just feel like it would be different when we're talking about African Americans, Black Americans, descendants of slaves, getting their just due payments, right? That we're printing this money for them to spend in America. And again, I honestly believe that these people, and again, I don't even think it's going to hurt our economy, because to be honest with you, I think that 60% of African Americans, Black descendants of slaves, ADOS, again, I'm still having to get used to saying the word, they honestly don't even want to be here, to be honest with you, John. And I think if you gave them the money, and let's just create an example, in my opinion, I think it's $5 trillion owed, right? Less money than we paid for the 2009 collapse to J.P. Morgan and Citigroup and many others. So $5 trillion per person. I haven't done the math, but just throw it out there. $500,000 per person over 18. that's black in America. Probably a lot less, but I'm just throwing it out there. I think 60% of those people, and I think the majority, white majority of people in America, the powers that be, I call them the powers that be, who have a angst against black people receiving these funds, they understand that most of these blacks would probably leave the country if they were given that money. And I think that money should be given to African Americans. I don't think it should be a rolling in of payment. It should be a one-time thing. I don't want to see payments over the course of monthly or yearly, because knowing the American government, I know it's, you get it for a couple months and then they'll come in with an excuse and take it away. That they'll take the money and leave. And they'll go to other countries, more than likely Africa or Europe or the Caribbean, and influence a global or create a global opportunity for wealth growth and infrastructure building. So give me an example. Back to my question. Give me an example. Why do you think it would be bad for America if just this one group got the money, when I personally think it'd be a boom for the world globally?
Well, let's go back to what you were saying about how, we printed money back in the old days, generations ago, for some kind of national event like a war, for example, which is true. We back, starting with the Revolution and going through the 19th century's wars and 20th century wars, we printed money, which and created a lot of inflation to fund a war, and then we stopped printing money and we raised interest rates and we brought all the inflation out. Now, after the Second World War, we started to print money not for war-based reasons. We started to print it for government programs that were perpetual in nature, that would stand around forever. Now, as far as reparations go, and you say $5 trillion, I just want to start to narrow in on some details. But you say you estimate it would be what, $5 trillion maybe?
I'd say $5 trillion. I don't even think ADO should have a conversation if they're talking anything less than $5 trillion as a group. But go ahead.
Okay, so let's just start with that. So $5 trillion. Right away, I see some issues in the sense that our federal budget right now is $4 trillion, and $1 trillion of that is pure deficit spending. So we have $3 trillion in revenues coming in. We have an extra $1 trillion that is being borrowed, and much of it being printed up to just keep current programs and departments operating. So a $5 trillion payout would add $1 trillion to that. The issue coming up is inflation, because we would certainly have to print the money up. If we don't raise enough funds through borrowing money, then interest rates would rise. You would have the economy eventually going into a recession because of the higher interest rates, trying to entice lenders to give us money to pay the extra $1 trillion. If we don't get money from the lenders, then we'll just print the money up and create inflation. So inflation is the real bad guy here, because inflation devalues the dollar. It makes the money buy less. It sends prices higher. If African Americans were to receive a check, that seems like a good thing, until they realize that check does not go as far as it did before they received the check. When inflation comes in, then now you're going to see more people not able to afford things like filling their car up at the gas station, food, groceries, rent, car payments, health insurance, car insurance, tuition. We have been suffering from a lot of inflation already with a $4 trillion federal budget. A $5 trillion program, which would be the reparations program, would be added on to a $4 trillion budget. So if you add both together, you're talking $9 trillion, $5 trillion for reparations, plus the $4 trillion that we're already spending, of which a quarter of that is deficit. So actually, the entire $5 trillion would be all deficit spending. And you would have enormous inflation coming in from that. You would hurt the people who are in the bottom income ladder, because even though they have this money now, the money doesn't buy as much. Because where's the money come from? It's got to be printed up, because we're not going to be able to borrow that much money from lenders unless we jack interest rates up by double, triple, quadruple. And then, of course, you would put the economy in a recession if you do that. And actually, I think a recession would be a good thing, but just be on the lookout for a lot of people, including in the black community, who would lose their jobs in a recession. So I think that if you were to have a reparation program of $5 trillion, in theory, it sounds like a good idea, but keep in mind you are adding that to a $4 trillion budget, which already is based 25% on deficit spending. So you would actually bring in an extra $5 trillion of deficit spending on top of the $1 trillion that we're already doing. So the best way to put money into the African American community would not be through a reparation program featuring checks going out with money that is printed up, but it would be a reduction in taxes. You would have to eliminate the income tax. We have to reduce regulations that jack up the cost of business, jack up the cost of goods and services, and I think the most important thing, we need stable, sound money. If we have stable, sound money, a dollar will go farther. African Americans who are near the bottom in income already need their money to go farther. They need that dollar to buy more gasoline, more food, more of the goods and services they need. Instead of $2.70 a gallon, for example, with gas, if you had a strong currency, instead of costing $2.70 a gallon, it'd come down to $2, to $1.50, $1, 70 cents a gallon. That would make it to where low-income people, including African Americans, who comprise a disproportionately large percentage of low-income people, their money would go farther. The best way to do reparations is to stabilize the money, make the money go farther, reduce the taxes and the regulations that jack up the cost of living. If we try to do a $5 trillion payout, then the money, as soon as it hits the hands of African Americans, they will start to notice the cost of living going up as a result of the inflation due to printing up that $5 trillion.
Now, here's the thing, though, John. So here's the thing, though. I mean, what the ADOS community is specifically looking for is a solution that makes them American, right? Makes them part of the society. Because on the screen right now, I have a racial wealth inequality chart, which shows how the median household wealth for a white American is about $122,000, white family. And then for a black family, it's $1,200, John. And I'm trying to have you explain is how does, creating a more stable currency, how does minimizing the scale of government or the size of government, how does that close that gap when it benefits everybody? Don't we need to aren't the ADOS community right when they need a specific resolution to their situation? I mean, how do they really win when your solution benefits everybody? When it benefits the people who are already winning at the game as well as the people who are behind? How do the people behind really catch up? How does a 50-cent decrease in gas actually close the racial wealth gap if we were to go through with your plan?
Well, I think that actually the African American community would benefit even more than the white community, because they're already being punished the most by having bad money and a bad economic system with regulations that get in their way. Now, you talked about the difference in wealth. Well, one of the reasons why there's a wealth gap between two groups is because you do have an unemployment gap. I just recently made a video that I published on my YouTube channel titled Black Americans Should Be Libertarians. And the reason, and I go through the video, I show that there is a gap between black unemployment and white unemployment. Blacks are unemployed at double the rate of white Americans. And that is a gap that's existed almost for a century. The reason is because government regulations, minimum wage laws, started to go national back in the 30s. And states and local governments also began enacting minimum wage laws around that same time, when the Supreme Court allowed, they stopped striking down minimum wage laws, and they allowed two of them. One of them is the Davis-Bacon Act, and the other one is the Fair Labor Standards Act, two national minimum wage laws that to this day are considered constitutional. These laws keep blacks and other low-income people out of jobs, and because it raises the cost of their labor. So when you can't get a job, then you can't build wealth. Even if it's a minimum wage job, a low-paying job, that's the beginning of building wealth, because you can save money. By saving, you can invest in the stock market. You can invest in the real estate market. You can invest in the commodities market, like where gold and silver and cryptocurrencies are. You start out small, you build wealth that way. And when you have double the number of blacks being kept out of the labor force as whites, you're going to have a wealth gap there. Also, I talk about the influence of welfare programs, starting mainly in the 60s, when you have, and actually, this is kind of a reparation program that already exists, because we have checks, we have programs that send out checks to people of low income so that they can be able to take care of themselves based on their situation. However, it has done great harm to the black family. We start to see, for the first time in history, the black family disintegrate starting in the 60s. Today, over 70% of blacks are born outside of a two-parent home. If you have two parents growing up, then you have more income, and that more wealth can be created. It can be passed down to the children.
But John, wouldn't it be awesome to be able to have a black family that has $1 million in capital to be able to work with? I mean, wouldn't that improve? Wouldn't that end crime? Wouldn't that create businesses? Wouldn't that create wealth if we were able to give them $1 million? I know a few $1 million, white families, John, and they are doing really good, really, really good. I think even if they were to have some side effects in the economy, John, I think that'd be a lot of wealth building if we were to give black people in America $1 million.
Okay, so, but don't you think that if that money came in and you gave $1 million to each black family. Let's assume that's how that works. Don't you think there would be inflation? And then that $1 million ends up buying less. And it ends up buying less for everyone, but in particular, blacks get the $1 million. Where it goes is up to them. So I think that there's not only an inflation issue, but there's an issue of if that money is going to go to help black people, because the truth is, when money comes easy, it does get misallocated. I talk about in my book that, lottery winners often end up broke only 5 years after winning a huge jackpot. And the reason is because money, if it comes too quickly, the faster it comes, the faster it goes. I think that, and that's not to say everyone, of course. There are people who, even in that situation, would choose to do the right thing with their money. They would invest it, pay off debt, invest in their children's college fund. But generally, an economic rule that has always been true is that when too much money comes too easily, it gets misallocated, and it ends up going away from you very fast.
So, John, I would argue that the word "easily" there, I think it's a bit insulting to use, because I believe it's been earned, right? I believe it's been earned, and it's not necessarily something where I feel like we should compare respectfully. I'm saying this respectfully to you, that we should compare it to lottery winners, right? Because again, this is something that has been earned through death and sacrifice and so many other just horrible rape and just so many horrible things. So I believe it's been earned by the people who were to get this money. And John, I don't know, John. I just feel like even if $1 million were to earn less than before they got the money, it would be so much more than what somebody who has, $400 now, somebody who's working, who's black, born into that generational poverty, not able to save, not able to go on vacation, not able to move, right, to a better opportunity, not able to take their child and put them. I think it's better than that life, John. I think whatever consequences are for us to give them this money, I think it's better than that life. Would you agree?
So, yeah, I absolutely would agree. And I think that we need to look at the past to understand really how we can get there. We have actually seen a decline in the number of black businesses going back 30 plus years. I pointed this out in my YouTube video, Black Americans should be libertarians. We've seen the number of black banks, the number of black insurance companies decline over the last 30 years. That is hurting the black community. And the reason for that is because of the growth of government regulation, taxation, and devaluation of the currency. We actually had many more. We had dozens of black insurance companies back in the 1980s. Today, we only have 2 of them that exist. We had, I think, 60 black-owned banks back in the 80s, and today we only have, I think, 2 dozen. So we've been hurting blacks throughout the last, really the last century, and the reason is because it's become more expensive. Inflation has come in. You know, the unemployment rate, where I was talking about it, it's double more for blacks than for whites. From 1890 to 1930, there was no gap between black and white unemployment. Actually, there there was a gap between white females and black females during that time, and black females were employed more. They had it better. The black unemployment rate was actually lower than the white unemployment rate during that period of time because there was no minimum wage regulations. And we had a strong currency, a gold standard. So the cost of living was actually dropping in many cases. So it's not so much how much money you get. What is most important is what does the money buy. $1 million sounds like a lot of money if we just look at the average income, but $1 million can be worthless in a second under a hyperinflation situation. We had hyperinflation before, by the way, during the American Revolution. I talk about that in the book. We actually printed so much money that we sent the value down to zero in only 6 years. That is my concern with a $5 trillion reparation program on top of a $4 trillion budget. I think you would create a hyperinflation situation, and in that situation, your currency can go to zero in a few years, maybe a few months, or even a few weeks if it's very bad. So the idea of trying to put money into the African American community is a great one, and I say the best way to do that is, number one, you've got to keep the money stable. We've got to stop government from printing money, because if the money, it doesn't matter if you have $1 million or $10 million or $100 million, if its value goes to zero as a result of trying to print money up to make payments, then you're going to feel poor. You're going to be poor. This actually happened in Zimbabwe.
Now, here's the thing, though, John. Here's the thing, though, because I gotta get back on that. Wouldn't your scenario require that every single person who were to get the money stay in America and spend all of their money? I mean, to be honest with you, that hyperinflation scenario only happens if everybody spends all the money. Isn't that right? I mean, if I were to give you $1 million and you don't spend the money, that necessarily doesn't create inflation. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah, if the money does not enter the economy, yeah, it will not create inflation.
So your scenario is all the black people who were to get the money would have to spend all the money to create that situation. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I absolutely believe that if you put $1 million in the hands of someone who is poor, who is just trying to make ends meet, I can just imagine their imagination starting to run wild. They will start to think how much of a better life they could have with this $1 million. They're making, they're living paycheck to paycheck and struggling and trying to keep the lights on and the water on and stay in their home. Now they have $1 million. I can just imagine what they would start to think. Oh, I'm going to have a bigger house. I'm going to have, again, everybody spends their money differently, but would they all put it in the bank? I mean, for a second, at the very beginning, you might have a lot of people putting their money in the bank, but soon after, in maybe $100 or $1,000 intervals, $10,000 intervals, that money is going to start to come into the economy. It'll maybe start as a trickle, but before you know it, it'll be a flood. Because people, once they get this money, are they going to let it sit in the bank? They're going to start to do things with that money. They're going to start to pay for things that they've wanted, and slowly but surely you will have that inflation. That money will enter the economy. And I think $5 trillion could very easily, within a year, create a hyperinflation situation. It wouldn't happen all at once, but in the first few months, as people start to get this money, it will start to surge out forward. People will make decisions to use that money.
Now, here's the also, John, would you agree that people, once they receive this money, would look for ways to get the most bang for their money as well?
You mean, in other words, you mean look to save money when they have $1 million windfall?
Yes, would not necessarily save money, but would you agree that the ADOS community who receives this check would then look not only around their community, not only around this country, but around the world to see where they can get more bang for their buck? Would you agree that would take place?
Well, let's assume that happens. Let's assume they don't spend. In other words, you're saying that these people would not spend their money in America. They would spend it in foreign countries, right?
Yes, I'm saying that you have a large portion, an underestimated large portion. Because again, I believe that if you gave Black American people the opportunity to get up and go, I think most of them would get up and go. And their families would leave and create an opportunity for themselves in another part of the world. Just because it would just make more financial sense. And that means those who do decide to stay don't become the burden on the government that you think could happen. Don't create the hyperinflation that you think could happen. Am I right? If 40% of those people decide, hey, I'm going to Jamaica, I can have an incredible life with $1 million in Jamaica. I can have an incredible life with $1 million in Kenya, in Nigeria. And if you have 40% of people who get this money, that's earned, by the way, earned, right, through sacrifice, and they get up and leave, your scenario doesn't happen. Am I right?
Well, it would not. If the money is largely being spent overseas, then that's where the inflation would go. So let's say people decide, like you say, to move to Jamaica. First of all, I don't know exactly how many Black families there are in the country, but, I mean, let's assume that each one gets $1 million. I'm guessing there's, we have 12% of the population African American, so I'm not exactly sure the math between 30 and 40 million African Americans, I would say.
That's correct.
So you would simply send that inflation into foreign markets, and you would have a lot of people very upset. You would actually hurt a lot of people because the inflation would simply send prices up in those areas. So if these people get this money and they say, look, I'm going to move to a low-cost area in the world, and all of the money I get from reparations will be spent there, or let's say 60% or a majority, because, everything is costing less here. Well, it will cost less until the money starts getting spent. And then the local populations, this is why I say this would hurt people. Local populations are going to start to notice, hey, they can't afford to live because we've got people from the United States who are leaving who had windfalls because of a reparations program. They are now spending their money, and in our country, let's say Jamaica, local Jamaicans are going to start to notice the cost of living skyrocketing if too many people come there and spend too much money. Inflation happens wherever there is too much money chasing too few goods. So we would protect ourselves from the inflation if that money were to leave the country. But what about the countries where these Black families would go to spend their $1 million? You would then effectively export the inflation to those countries.
Now, if that were to happen, though, John, to get to that point where the individual within the country notices, wouldn't we have to get to anywhere between 5 to 10 to 20 years of possible development, business development, job growth, infrastructure growth in that society, wherever that is, for them to eventually realize that, right? Inflation doesn't tend to be necessarily overnight when we're talking about a few hundred people moving in to an 8 million person city like a Lagos or a Kinshasa or somewhere like that in the Congo, right? I mean, this would be a 20-year kind of thing for that to eventually hit the local person to where, oh my God, you know, a couple years ago or 10 years ago, we had all these African Americans come in, like you said, spending all this money. But in that wake of them arriving and spending that money within that society, wouldn't there be thousands of jobs created? As I said, thousands of businesses created? Wouldn't there be a actual increase in the amount and quality of life and development for those individuals because of the arrival of African Americans with those funds?
Well, see, it all depends on how, you know, there's something called velocity of money, how quickly it is circulating in the economy. It all depends really on how much people are spending. Now, if someone gets $1 million and they're only spending at the rate of $1,000 a year, you're not going to have as much inflation as if they're spending $10,000 or $100,000 a year. So, would it take 20 years? I doubt it, but it totally depends on the rate at which people are spending money. If they're spending money very quickly, you can have hyperinflation take place within the first year, easily. But if much of that money is being saved and not spent, then yes, it would take a lot longer to have that situation. And actually, you could avoid hyperinflation altogether if you don't have a quick flow of money coming into the economy continuing over a long period of time. But what causes an economy to develop is it's not creating more money. Creating more money it's not the original spark of economic growth. What develops economies is when businesses become more efficient in their productivity. They start to rely more on technologies that enhance human labor. And yes, that requires investment. But you already have money circulating in the economy before you have newcomers coming in. So the way that economies develop is through businesses becoming more efficient in the production of their products. I talked about in my book how we used to pick cotton and process cotton. And, you know, of course, this is where the slavery comes in. But we used to do that by hand. Then someone invented something called the cotton gin, which reduced the time and effort and money required to process cotton. This allowed for us to process cotton more. The price came down, and when prices come down, the savings of the community pile up. That's where money is created to invest in infrastructure development, new businesses, new jobs. But somebody had to come up with the idea to create a more efficient method of production, which would produce savings by bringing the product price down. So creating money without creating goods just creates inflation. If you're able to create goods more than you create money, that is how you build an economy.
But John, your method, again, I'm looking for a solution that's specifically going to address the wealth income gap for the ADOS community. I'm looking for a way to specifically address that situation. Your solution, your solution would make the guy who killed Trayvon Martin financially well off too. If that's, that's the truth, isn't it? I mean, what I want to look for is I don't want a solution that benefits the people who have oppressed ADOS, right? I don't want to support a solution that's going to help them, right? They have been people who have oppressed the ADOS community through all kinds, Jim Crow, terrorism. Just pure terrorism, right? Over policing and all of this. So I don't want a solution that's going to make their lives better. I don't want a solution as an African that's going to put them in a situation where they come to my country, right? The Congo, that they go to another African country. I don't want a solution that makes them better. I want a solution that addresses specifically the inequality that has been created because these people were walked off the plantation and given nothing because of their labor, right? And now we've created this ADOS movement. Not we, I should say Yvette Carnell, Tone Talks, Dr. Garrity, and others, that specifically addresses their claim, right? Right.
Okay, so you say AU, is it pronounced AUS? Is that it?
It's ADOS. American Descendants of Slaves. And again, for those of you guys watching this in the future, I'll have links to the ADOS101.com website that talks to you about their movement and who they are, what they represent, what they're exactly asking for. But that is what I want to address, and that's why I'm supporting that movement financially through breakingbrown.com with a monthly donation and others, because I just feel that this is a righteous movement, that this is finally something that's really going to specifically target in on who deserves, to have their situation rectified, right? I don't want the racist cop in cities all across America to walk away with a check when this is all said and done. So he can buy another gun, so he can buy another house in the hills, so he can take his racist kids to, more schools further out the city. I don't want that for them. What solution do you have that could specifically address their need to have their situation rectified?
Okay, so I feel like now you've given me more clarity on your position. So you're not looking for a general something in which everyone will benefit.
That's correct. That's correct. The ADOS are absolutely against the idea of everybody being a part of this justice claim. They are specifically saying that as a American descendant of slave, which I am not, I am an African, first generation, came to this country, right? I am an immigrant. So I'm not even privy to what this reparation offered would be. They're saying that, of course, because they came here unwillingly, they were sold, raped, murdered, exploited, taken off the plantation, right, or won their freedom through their participation in the Civil War, not given what was promised to them, not given what was promised in many other reward programs. If we go back to, gosh, I know, John, I read in your book, Homestead Acts, right? Homestead Acts that many African Americans were excluded from, even though they righteously, per the wording, should have qualified. Many of them were excluded from. Overwhelming majority of black people were excluded from. Also, you had situations where, people who were lucky enough to be given land from maybe a quote unquote, kind slave owner would eventually get their lands stolen back from, whether it be state laws, local laws, or sometimes also just by being chased off by violence off the property, right? So they are using all of these events to say, this is what's happened to us, right? This is where we are as a group. Now, this is what you have to pay us to rectify those damages. This is what you have to pay us to make us Americans in America. And I think that's a very, very fair offer being made. And there's a moral, I don't want to say a moral obligation, but it's probably a stronger word than that. But for this nation to meet that, because we can meet it. We really can.
So I think you know more about ADOS than I do. So let me ask, because I can learn from you about this as far as what they're asking for, what they believe. So, and then be able to comment on information you give me. But this organization, do you know how many people are in or involved or represent this organization roughly?
To be honest with you, right now it's basically, I don't want to call it predominantly online, but it does have its foundation so far online. Now, there is a scheduled meeting of the minds taking place, right, where it's going to finally get some kind of foundation to where I think you're going to start seeing little clubs and things like that being built as this meeting of the minds concludes. But if I had to put the ADOS community in terms of people who are maybe aware of what this is right now, I would put it at maybe 250,000 black people right now in America know what ADOS means right now. I think if and again, these are just simply people who are online, connected to the kind of like social fabric of black diaspora, of the black online diaspora right now. I would say maybe 250,000 people right now.
Okay, so as far as reparations, have they given a number, a dollar figure on what they feel is fair or would remedy be sufficient reparations?
Per person, they have not given that. The conversation now is, it started at 100 billion and then it moved up a little bit. Right now, the conversation so far, from what I've gathered, is at $1 trillion. A set number hasn't been made. I personally came out with the $5 trillion mark, and that's just based on amateurish research that I've done when I've been reading notes from the 1840s, when I'm reading plantations generating almost $500,000 in today's money, right? And we're talking small plantations with 100 persons in terms of revenue being generated from what they were producing. So, doing some really amateurish math, I just felt like 5 trillion would be fair amount. But per person, I have not, and they have not came out with a number. Right now, it's just about getting them to get the Democratic Party to be on board, right? So hey, if you want our vote, then you need to be down with rectifying this wealth inequality gap. And right now, the Democratic Party has not bent to their will. And if the elections were held today, I can tell you, John, the Democratic Party would lose. They would single-handedly lose, because this ADOS community is not only well-educated, they are well-informed, and they're well-connected in a way that I think that the bougie blacks or the uppity black class is really overestimating their ability to get out the vote and underestimating the ADOS community ability to get out the vote. And that's basically where we are with this.
Okay, so so somewhere between, according to what you think, 100 billion and 1 trillion is what you think they've, I guess, been dabbling around with as far as a total amount.
That's correct. That's correct. About 100 billion to a trillion right now. It's basically where the conversation is.
Okay, so now, so do they have an ID? Have they said how they think the money would be generated? Because you do have to have a means to generate payments in order for payments to exist. So have they said, as far as a plan, for example, have they said, you know what, we think there should be a tax on Wall Street speculation? Because one of the things that these Democratic candidates, say Bernie Sanders, for example, has been saying is, we're going to pay for big programs, we're going to pay for tuition-free public colleges, we'll pay for national health care by putting a tax on Wall Street speculation, or a tax on estates, for example, that are over $50 million or whatever. Has ADOS said, we support a special tax, or we support some kind of special adjustment to federal finances to make those reparations possible?
No, and respectfully, I don't think that's their job, because we've never done that for any other group that has demanded and gotten reparations. The money was printed and given to those people. And I honestly believe, whether it was the Japanese, the Jewish, who, by the way, we didn't have nothing to do with the Holocaust, and we gave them money. Native Americans, and we still, by the way, give, those groups money.
You're right.
By the way,
you're right. Now that I just wanted to say, now that you mention that, we have done something with we have a whole federal agency designed to
give them money
to finance Native Americans, and we did give reparations to the Japanese for the World War II internment camps. We did, and I maybe some other groups, but the two that jump out are the Japanese and the Native Americans. So
absolutely. And again, no particular tax plan that I'm aware of was levied to give them that money. I think they should get the money the same way J.P. Morgan Chase got money, John. The same way that Chase got money. The same way that Goldman Sachs got money. We went into a back room and printed that money. And for them, total cost, I'm seeing for Trump's tax cut was over $1 trillion. For them, during the 2009 was over, I'm hearing 24 trillion. For Iraq, over 2 trillion. Iraq, Afghanistan. So we can do it. We can do it. We've done it before. So, nobody, the inflation, I hear what you're saying. But nobody said that for that war. They told us that, hey, these people have weapons of mass destruction. They're coming to get us. They're going to kill us, blah, blah, blah. We printed the money. The economy is going to go crush. We're going to lose our standard of living. Everything could be on. We printed the money. We gave J.P. Morgan a Chase. The CEOs went all to Washington and blah, blah, blah. We printed them the money. Now they're saying we're worse off now than we were then. I am in full belief that if we were to print up $1 trillion for the African American ADOS community, that we would not be worse off 10 years from now than we are now. I think we'll be a better nation. I think we'll be a more just nation. I think the black community will be better off. Those who want to stick around can stick around. Those who want to bounce, God bless you. Take care. You know what I mean?
Okay. So you think that the best, just correct me if I'm wrong, but the best way would be to do what we've done in the past with other situations, whether it's with the Iraq War or with pretty much the Great Society or with any program which we fund through printing money. Because, in fact, we had to print money if we're going to finance it when we don't have enough tax revenues and when we're not selling enough bonds to the public. So printing money is the only way we've been paying for a lot of these post-World War II initiatives and programs. And to print up $1 trillion would be okay with you to make the reparation payments to African Americans.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I just don't feel that every African American, every ADOS member is going to go out and blow their money in a week. Will there be some people who will recklessly spend their money? Absolutely. People are fine to make their own decisions. There's going to be somebody who's going to get the check and going to think they're going to flip it and lose everything, right? And that person will suffer the consequences of that. But will there be a majority of people who are going to, look over that money, invest wisely, spend wisely, look for ways to get the best for their money? I absolutely believe that. We've got to get beyond the whole idea of this is what we think they're going to do and just say, look, let's give them the money and see what happens. Because at this point, the difference, John, between white and black at this point is just, it's too wide. It's too wide. You've been to the airport. I've been to the airport. John, I can't tell you, when you go into some of these international airports and you see white people with smiling faces, their children excited, they're going to France, they're going to Italy, they're going to all these amazing places. And what are all the black people doing? They're pushing carts of old white people. They're flipping burgers, selling cookies, cutting the tickets. John, the people who are doing the work in the airports can't afford to get on the planes. We cannot have another 100 generations of this. It cannot continue. It cannot continue. And the ADOS community and the ADOS movement has risen to rectify this situation, because we are entering a scenario where if this doesn't get solved within the next 10 years, John, black people in America who are descendants of slavery will be in perpetual poverty for their life. They will literally be born into economic destitution with no way of getting out. I have a chart right now on the screen that shows you that even people with college degrees, if you're lucky enough to get employed, you still don't do as well as the average member of the majority, an average white person who has the same education. It's unfair. It's absolutely unfair, John. And I think a wealth distribution specifically to the ADOS community would address this this inequality and create and really bring this. I mean, I can imagine just the amount of jobs and business growth that would take place in some of these inner city communities, the amount of pride that would return back to these inner city communities, the amount of respect, the drop in crime. I mean, the crime would just basically fall on its head. I don't think you wouldn't have. I would be very surprised if you would see gun violence after a community gets that kind of money in its hands. I would be really surprised.
So, does ADOS, do they say anything? Are they just a single issue organization, or do they talk about wanting other things besides reparations?
No, this is the issue, because every issue, and they make very good sense, every issue is basically solved by this issue. Whether we talk about criminal justice reform, whether we talk about poverty, or we talk about inequality in education levels, whatever, healthcare, whatever, it's all due to the fact that black people in America are born into a system of inequality, systematic inequality, caused by the legacy of slavery, the oppression of Jim Crow, the denial of the Homestead Act participation, and many others. And I believe that the ADOS solution could be what rectifies finally that gap.
Okay, and they, so everything as they see it is centered around getting reparations. You would, according to ADOS, you would make right these other issues through getting reparations. You would close the wealth gap between whites and blacks in America and make health care and education and housing and food more affordable if they were to get the reparations that they're seeking, and of course through the idea of printing money, because that's actually easier to do than levying a tax or by trying to sell treasury bonds. Printing money is very easy to do because all you need is the treasury to do it. You don't have to reach out to the public for any assistance. So as they see it, it's the reparations that bring all these other issues under control.
Absolutely. And I would agree with them, because you see it in the numbers when we talk about white communities. When you see white communities that have large amounts of wealth, you find lower crime. You find higher rates of education attainment. You find lower gun violence. You find, low larceny, very little, if any, larceny or any kind of that kind of behavior. Wealth is really the solution to all of those things. And I think this is a movement that finally coming out of the black community that could very well solve those issues that have been plaguing the black community for so long, that the federal government has been, unable to solve with these horrible programs. Just cut them the check and let wealth do its thing. Let responsible human beings take it, take what's owed to them and make the decisions that they feel is going to best, affect their lives. I truly believe that.
So you know what? You know what that sounds like? That sounds a lot like the argument for universal basic income, which is actually that same argument that you just made, which is that we should get rid of the government programs, of which we've got thousands of them, probably millions if you were to add state and local, but just the federal government, thousands of programs. We should get rid of all those and instead create a program that will take the place of all the welfare programs, a cash-based system that would pay them in perpetuity and pay a certain amount per month. And I'm guessing, well, you basically told me this is a group that does not want payouts to non-descendants of slaves.
Absolutely.
So
I'm well aware that they, and I wouldn't support the ADOS community if they decided to get, for example, the Chinese community in on this, or the Irish community, or any other. I'm not interested in seeing any other group being a part of this, because these people did not build this country. Did they participate? Absolutely. But they were not the foundation for which the capital that eventually created the Industrial Revolution was created out of. They were not the seed of that, right? They were not the, what's the word for it? The syringe, right? That was used to pump America and create the wealth that created the Industrial Revolution. They weren't that. They played a role, and again, every group can point to a part in time where they were discriminated, but nothing anywhere in comparison to the chattel system of slavery that we had here in this country for over, what was it, 400 years, right? Or 250, whatever it was.
Yeah, it was yeah. So okay. So this is, I just want to say I'm glad we're having this conversation because I'm learning. This is more your, you know more about ADOS, and I actually never heard of this particular organization. But what it sounds like, based on what you know, is that they're really seeking something that resembles a specialized or descendants of slaves only universal basic income program. Because that's very much what it sounds like, in the sense that they don't approve of all these different programs, but they do want cash payouts that are exclusive to them.
Exclusive to them, absolutely. But my thing is, I don't know if they're. I have to ask Yvette, because I'm going to send her an email and ask her, is she interested in the idea of be a payment system? Because personally, I don't, even as an immigrant to this country, as someone who served this country, I don't trust this country enough to say that they're going to follow through on a monthly payment thing. I would like to see a one-time payment for the full amount to the descendants of slaves in America. I do not trust this country an iota to put that in a monthly payment system. They're going to come up, they'll let it go 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and come up with a solution. Well, right now, because of this, they will create a scenario where they basically run out of money and they have to cancel. So I'm not interested in seeing a monthly payment. In fact, and I wouldn't get behind the ADOS community if they're talking about getting monthly payments. I wouldn't want to see it, because I know they're going to take it back from you. I already know that, you know. And
so basically a lump sum payment, one-time lump sum payment to the descendants of slaves.
I'd love that. Absolutely, absolutely. We don't want the people who killed Freddie Gray to get a check. We don't want the cop who choked Eric Gardner to get a check. The cop who killed, I forgot our sister's name, who died in prison. The cop who killed Tamir Rice. You know, we don't want these people to benefit from this situation. We want the people who have been oppressed, people who have been exploited historically, systematically, you know, excluded from opportunity in America. They should be the ones to only benefit, and that's completely fair. And I think as voters, right, as voters who are overwhelmingly large and faithful voters to the Democratic Party, I think it's a very fair question for them to ask of every single politician who is seeking their vote whether or not they support the idea of reparations for black Americans. I think that's a very fair question. And I know there are a lot of white liberals who hate the ADOS movement. But guess what? They've been exploiting them for so long. And John, you've been on my show. You've talked about how liberals have exploited black people for years. And now the game is up. The game is up. If you're not down for the ADOS, then you're not going to get the vote and you're not going to win. And it's simple as that. And the black community, and the ADOS community specifically, is willing to go through a winter, right? A winter of political destitution for the Democratic Party to eventually get on board.
So, you know, actually, I think that there's a way that you could make this work.
Okay.
Here's the thing, though. It would involve something that the ADOS, I guess, has not brought up or mentioned. And maybe this is something they can start thinking about, because it's not that this country can't afford to make payments. We've got more money than any other nation in the world. It's not that we can't afford it. It's that, and this is the key, we can't afford to do it with the current size of government. So you could do a reparations program, and like we mentioned before, we've already done it for other ethnic groups. We could do a reparations program, but we would, if it were to be $1 trillion or more, or let's say anywhere between $100 billion to $1 trillion, but let's just say $1 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
If, in fact, we were to do a reparations program for descendants of slaves valued at $1 trillion, we would have to, I hope ADOS is listening, you've got to reduce not just the size of government, but you've got to reduce the scope of the regulations and taxes that we have. Because with our economy growing at only about 2% a year, see, this is where the money comes from. The money really comes from economic growth. Back in the days when the Japanese were getting reparations, the economy was growing. And by the way, do you have a specific, because I'm not fresh on this exact date, but do you know when the Japanese were getting reparations?
I don't have a specific date, but I do know it was after World War II. In fact, I want to say it was in the mid to early 1950s.
Okay, so in other words, it was before, would you say it was before the 1970s?
That's correct. Oh, yes,
okay.
Yes, definitely before the 1970s.
Okay, the thing about the 50s and the 60s is that our economy was growing at more than 4% a year during those decades. In fact, if you average up the GDP growth rates for both decades, you come out to more than 4% per year. That is more than double what we're growing at today. We're growing at about 2% a year. So we're growing at half the rate, slightly less than half the rate that we did back then when we were compensating the Japanese. So our economy has got to grow faster if we're going to make the money available for reparations, which I believe are just due as far as, you know, having compensated other groups. Yes, we're definitely, you know, the descendants of slaves are due compensation, but you wouldn't be able to make it happen at a rate of 2% growth per year. So we've got to get our growth rate up to historic, to where they were back during not just the 50s and 60s, but we used to grow at 7% a year during the Industrial Revolution. So the way that you get the growth rate of our economy up is you have to get rid of these excess taxes, regulations, and you got to have stable money. During the 50s and 60s, we had stable money. I know I was talking about this earlier, but I see this as tied right in. We can make it work, but you've got to deal with the size of government. We had a gold standard which prevented inflation from forming during the economy, during the 1950s and 60s in the economy. We were able to pay for things much better without causing the kind of economic damage that we would cause today. Mm-hmm. But we had a smaller government. I mean, we had whole departments that didn't even exist back then. When we were paying the Japanese, we did not have a Department of Education, Housing, and Urban Development. We did not. These are multi-billion-dollar departments. We were on a gold standard.
But here's the thing, though. Speaking of the Japanese, though, John, and I don't want to move far away from our ADOS conversation here, is that, you know, when it comes to them, their country rather, they're currently running with a GDP that's or a debt obligation, or a national debt obligation that's twice their GDP. We're not there yet, right? So we definitely have the ability to generate more debt, right? I mean, we do have that ability. I mean, if the Japanese can be doing it, and they have been doing it for well over 20 years, almost 30 years now, rather, running on a national debt that's twice their GDP. Why can't we do it as well?
Well, because the big difference between the United States and Japan, and that is our currency. Our currency is the world reserve currency. There's a special responsibility that we have on trying to maintain the value of our currency that the Japanese never had. They go into debt, they print their own money, but it only affects their economy. When we do it, it affects the entire world economy because every foreign central bank, for the most part, is holding U.S. dollars. So if we go into anything that causes our currency to lose too much value too quickly, that will first hit the rest of the world, because the rest of the world uses American money. You know, the Japanese yen is not something that you got a few countries that have some deals with Japan, I guess, and they use their currency, but it's not the world reserve currency. So our currency being the world reserve means that other central banks are counting on us not to devalue it too much, because if they do, then they will send that money back to us, which is where the inflation comes in. They will go to a new world currency, a currency that will most likely be backed by something to keep it from being devalued. But there's a special responsibility on us that if we inflate the money supply too much, it will blow up in our face, because we will end up exporting that inflation automatically because we buy imports. If you were to print money then and give it to African American descendants of slaves, they will export that inflation. The way they'll do it is by purchasing imports. So much of our country is dependent on imports. We got, I think, 12% of our country, 12% of our economy is based on foreign trade. So if we try to do what Japan does, I know their debt to GDP is like 250%, I think. And they've been doing that for pretty much since the late 80s when the real estate market crashed. Well, ours is about 105% right now. So it is substantially less than that of Japan. I don't think we would be able to get anywhere near Japan in our debt to GDP ratio, because the world would rebel against that. We would have a flood of money coming, a flood of dollars from these foreign central banks rushing back into the United States. And that's where the inflation would begin to explode in the U.S. I know you said that, well, if the descendants of slaves, if they were to move out of the country, well, that's a possibility, but we don't know. We don't know if, you know, this is one of those things where we can speculate all day about whether or not most of them would stay here or leave. But if they were to stay here and just spend their money on imports, then they're going to export that inflation, which will then come right back to us. It'll boomerang back, because as the dollar loses value, it will be dumped by all of the foreign central banks. They're going to reject it and send it back to the U.S. So that's why the comparison between us and Japan is we have a world currency that is basically being held by the rest of the world, and if we trash the currency, the rest of the world will dump it, and that will hurt us more than any other country. So I think that, but again, you could do a reparations program. It's just that you have to get so much government out of the way. You know, we're spending $4 trillion now. If we got our government budget down to $1 trillion, then you could do this kind of program and not take on debt. You could actually do a reparations program without debt, without having to devalue the currency. But the way you would have to go about it is you have to cut out so much of this other spending that we're doing. And that way you would generate economic growth, because you get more growth when the money is stable. You get more growth when you reduce regulations, such as the minimum wage laws, such as occupational licensing laws. I mean, there's probably millions of regulations that are clamping down on economic growth. Get rid of the income tax. The income tax alone costs $200 billion plus just to comply with the tax.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot of money, John. That's definitely a lot of money, and obviously, John, you know, this is a conversation we can go on and on and on about, but obviously time constraints limit us into what I think we've talked now for an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, regarding this ADOS situation. Those of you guys who are definitely still watching, again, I have Jonathan Bogan's complete contact information in the description. Those of you who are watching this, including as well as Yvette Carnell, the ADOS 101 community. Visit their website if you're interested in sponsoring them. Go to breakingbrown.com. They are accepting donations as little as just $2 per month. If we can get 100,000 African Americans to offer just $2 a month, I mean, we imagine the kind of influence that they could put on the Democratic Party and other politicians in Washington to pursue this policy. John, is there any lasting words that you want to provide to the people in regards to those seeking this reparation stance? Obviously, we know what your disagreement is, but then again, I just leave with the fact that, you know, the average black person has a net worth of $8 in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, for example. The average African American, black American, is worth less than $25,000 in Los Angeles, whereas the average white person is worth over $150,000. So, you know, as much as we love your tax plan idea, we just need something that's going to rectify the situation now, specifically for that group. But what are your lasting words? And if you can do it quickly for us, to tell the people who are listening right now.
Sure. Well, I do appreciate the opportunity to give my views on these issues. I think that the idea of reparations is not it's not a bad idea if you've got the right type of system in place. This country can afford to do it if we make the right types of cuts in so much other government spending. I'm not dead set against reparations, but I am dead set against the idea of keeping current levels of spending and regulation and taxation and then adding a reparations program to that. I think you can make room for reparations if you were to cut down at least more than half of current spending by government. And you got to have more economic growth. Growing at 2% a year, I don't believe is going to produce enough money to make reparations that descendants of slaves want to have. I think we need to at least double our growth rate, if not triple our growth rate. And the only way we can do that is by shrinking the size of government. In the past, we had faster growth because we had a smaller government. Today, with all the technology that we have, we should be growing faster. We're growing slower because government has grown much more than the ability of technology to create growth. So the reparations idea, it's not that it's too expensive. It's that it is too expensive with our current economy and current size of government. If we were to push that aside, we could make way for it. And we could do it without printing money. I am dead set against the idea of printing money because I understand that inflation comes in and destroys the value of money, and ultimately would destroy the very incomes of those people receiving reparations. So we can do this right, but I just want people to understand there's so much more that has to be done before reparations can exist. And that deals with the size of government, and I want ADOS members to get a copy of my book. And you would be able to learn a lot more about why I hold to this theory that we would be much better off and able to make reparation payments with a smaller government. So my book is on Amazon for $18. Say No to Big Government. Also, my YouTube channel, Libertarian Black Man, is where I publish videos giving my point of view about issues and history, and I would like to have people subscribe to that. I just want people to know how government is causing so much problems as far as our ability to do anything anymore in this country. And if we were to shrink the size of government, we could do so much more. We could make reparations without having to print any money at all.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. ADOS community, I know you're probably upset at his thoughts, but hey, you always have to hear the other side of the argument. Support this brother. He put out a really awesome book. Hopefully one of you guys in the ADOS community can write your own book about why, this is needed. You definitely have the right to do it, and it will definitely add legitimacy to your claim. Besides just a moral one, it's good to have something on paper that can be studied and can have reasons behind it. But again, this community has done so much for this country that might not even really honestly be necessary. I just feel like it's long-term due, and they just got to get it. They got to get the check. And if the Democratic Party doesn't understand that, don't vote for them, people. Don't vote for them. And what's the worst that Trump can do? I mean, that the African-American community has not already been through. Let's just be honest. And white liberals need to understand that you guys are willing to go through a winter of 20 years of Republican rule, if that means that the Democrats have to be in the force to kind of get you guys to understand, to get them to understand that this is serious and you guys mean business as a community. So I want to thank my host, my co-host today, Jonathan Bogan. Again, please subscribe to his Twitter, subscribe to his awesome YouTube, putting out content week in, week out. Great content. John, I see your YouTube is growing as well. Man, that's awesome to see. Twitter's influence is growing as well. That's awesome to see. So again, I want to thank you for being on the show. I hope this continues to add to your subscriber base as well.
Oh yeah, I appreciate the putting me out there and allowing me to be on the show. And there's definitely a lot of issues that are going to come up soon, and I definitely look forward to coming back and talking more, and we will definitely gain understanding from each other's discourse.
Absolutely. There it is. Thank you so much, John. Thanks a lot for the call, bro.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again. If you aren't a subscriber, please subscribe. I will be starting a new channel specifically to address issues as we move into the 2020 election cycle. This is a very exciting topic for me. I really am energized and excited about the ADOS community and what they're doing. And as a first-generation African in America who's looking to return back to Africa, I'm just so excited about the potential to be able to recruit and bring, thousands, hundreds, maybe even just 10, 5 African Americans who will have the ability to come to Africa and invest there because they've been able to get what is due to them. It's your boy Sal. I'm out of here. Take care.